Living near Hildene, the historic estate of Robert Todd Lincoln, I always take an interest in any new books or writing I see related to Abe Lincoln. So when I saw some impressive reviews in both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal about a relatively new book, An American Marriage, the untold story of Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd, I reached out to the author, Professor Michael Burlingame. And thank you, Professor Burlingame, for coming on to our show. Thank you for being
here. Thank you,
here.
Danny, for inviting me. I relish every opportunity I can get to speak about my favorite subject without having to grade anybody's papers or exams.
Well, it's been said that there have been more books written about Abe Lincoln than any other U.S. president. So why this one at this particular time?
Well, I have written about the Lincoln marriage before. And my very first book, which appeared back in 1994, was called The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln. It was a series of psychological essays exploring his relationship with his parents and with his children and with his wife and his depressions and that sort of thing. And I had discovered a great deal of new information about the Lincoln marriage, which was incorporated into this as one of the essays in that book. And it became a national news story. I couldn't believe it. My book was a University of Illinois Press book. It was not a commercial press and all that, but it got enormous publicity because on 2 pages in that 400-page book, I have accounts of Mrs. Lincoln physically abusing her husband, striking him in the face, drawing blood, chasing him out of the house with a knife, chasing him out of the house with a broom, and spousal abuse. And this was 1994. Spousal abuse that summer happened to be a particularly hot topic because O.J. Simpson had just allegedly murdered his ex-wife and her boyfriend. So it was widely known that I had written this, and I had dug up an awful lot of new information. Now, I assumed not everybody would agree with my interpretations, but that all subsequent authors would have to deal with the information that I had dug up rather laboriously and painstakingly. But the subsequent books about the Lincoln marriage ignore that. Well, then I published a 2,000-page biography of Lincoln back in 2009, and I included a lot of new information about the marriage, which didn't reflect much credit on Mrs. Lincoln. And I said, well, now people will start to pay attention to the evidence that I have dug up when they write about the Lincoln marriage, but they don't. Daniel Mark Epstein and others who've written about the Lincoln marriage just ignore all the stuff that I have uncovered. And so I then decided, you know what? If anybody wants to know about the Lincoln marriage, just a layperson, would they go to a book with a rather generic title, The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln? Probably not. Or a rather intimidating, daunting 2,000-page biography? Probably not. So I thought I'd like to write a modest-sized, say, 300-page book just on the Lincoln marriage, incorporate all the information that I had dug up for the first book and then the big biography. And then in the subsequent, in the 10, 12 years since the big book appeared, newspaper databases have expanded exponentially. And so it's so much easier to do newspaper research than it used to be. And so I consulted these newspaper databases, dug up a lot of new information from those sources, added them to what I'd already done, and produced this 300-page book. So I'm hopeful that it will set the record straight. And the reason I want this understood is because we cannot appreciate Lincoln's triumph over adversity unless we understand how difficult his marriage was. That for all those years, a year in and year out, Lincoln had to deal with this very difficult woman who physically abused him, who ridiculed him, who embarrassed him as president by engaging in all kinds of unethical behavior. And so I wrote the book in the hopes that that this would help people understand how incredible Lincoln's triumph over adversity was, particularly because everybody knows that he grew up in frontier poverty and everybody knows that he didn't have a formal education, but they don't know that he had to deal with this almost impossibly difficult wife for over 20 years and how he managed to do that successfully.
So, Professor Burlingame, did he go into this marriage clueless, or was he aware of Mrs. Lincoln's behaviors?
Um, Lincoln, I argue, married her because she seduced him and said, "You've got to marry me to protect my honor." Now, there's no hard evidence for that. You should pardon the expression, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence. This, by the way, was not my original interpretation. That is, this was put forward by a very fine Lincoln scholar in Springfield, Illinois, a gentleman named Wayne Temple. But it seemed to me that it made sense because Lincoln tells a number of people that he doesn't love Mary Todd enough to marry her. He tells one of his two groomsmen on the wedding day that he had two groomsmen. He told one of them that he was being forced into the marriage. And it was widely assumed that it was a loveless match. An awful lot of people in Springfield said that they didn't seem to have the kind of attraction to one another that you would expect. And they got married on one day's notice, which was very unusual for people in Mary Todd's background because she was from the social elite. And the social elite of Springfield had big, elaborate weddings. And her sister, with whom she was living, her older sister, planned to have a big, elaborate wedding for Mary, just as she had had for her other sister, Frances, a couple of years earlier. But no, they got married on one day's notice. And their first child was born less than 9 months later, a little bit less. That doesn't necessarily prove it, but it's certainly suggestive. And so I think that that Lincoln was trapped into the marriage, but that he was willing to go along with it to protect her honor and also to protect his own honor, because he had promised to marry her, and then he broke the engagement. And for over a year, they were hardly saw each other. Then they got back together briefly, and then abruptly got married. And so I think he broke the engagement because he realized they were incompatible.
So, Professor, was there any similarity or comparison to Lincoln's first love, Nancy Rutledge, who died?
Her name was Anne Rutledge.
Anne Rutledge,
yeah, right. Anne Rutledge was a relatively uneducated, at least by the standards of the day, at least compared to Mary Todd. Mary Todd was educated. She was from a wealthy background, socially prominent background, and the like. And Anne Rutledge was a village girl. She was the daughter of the village tavern keeper, hotel keeper, so they were very different. And Lincoln's friends said that if he had married a woman like Anne Rutledge, he probably never would have been president. That he would have been happily ensconced as a rural lawyer, raising children and interacting with them and loving his family life. But he married this woman who made his life so miserable. He stayed away from home as much as possible. He politicked and networked as much as possible, devoted so much of his intellectual and emotional energy to his political career that he never would have done if he had been happily married.
I just want to go back to the issue of so many books being written about Lincoln.
Right.
And what I find interesting, at least with the top 25 books on Lincoln, that even though I believe Carl Sandburg was considered the quintessential expert historian writer about Lincoln during the 1950s and 1960s, which would have been about 100 years past Lincoln, all of these other books were written way post Sandburg into the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. Why is that?
Well, when Sandburg's 6-volume biography appeared in two big installments, one in the 1920s about the pre-presidential period, and then 4 volumes in the 1930s appeared about the presidency. Now, the books that I've written and subsequent scholars have written are based on information that was unavailable to Sandburg in those days. For example, the Lincoln Papers, that is Lincoln's incoming mail, the drafts of his speeches, the drafts of his responses to mail, all that sort of thing was in the Library of Congress and unavailable to scholars. It was locked up until 1947. So Sandberg wrote before the papers were available. So there's an awful lot of good information in those papers. And also the papers of his secretaries, John Hay and John George Nicolay. Those only became available after Sandberg had published his book. And a lot of the papers of the cabinet members became available only after Sandberg had written. And newspaper databases allow us to see so much more about what the press was reporting about Lincoln, including his own words, that just wasn't available to Sandberg. So the main reason why there have been so many books published since Sandberg's day is that they're based on a lot more information and more up-to-date information than Sandberg was able to consult.
So, Professor, a lot of your book provides lively, in-depth descriptions about the antics of Mrs. Lincoln and the messy circumstances she seemed to get involved with, to the degree that many people believe she was mentally ill. And
yes,
can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think she was mentally ill. In all likelihood, she suffered from manic depression. That is bipolar disorder, as we call it today, that she would go from periods of extreme lows to extreme highs. And that is a form of this very serious mental disorder, which is usually inherited. So she seems to have suffered very seriously from that problem. And one of the things that people who have that disorder do when they're in their manic phase is to spend money like crazy. And Mrs. Lincoln does that, particularly as First Lady, and gets into all kinds of trouble. Then another aspect of her mental illness is she had a terrible temper. Now, it was such that she would lash out at her husband, and as I suggested earlier, would physically abuse him and chase him out of the house. And as a result, Lincoln would stay away from home as much as possible. As a lawyer in Springfield in his day, you couldn't make enough money just by staying in Springfield. So every spring and every fall, Lincoln and a bunch of other lawyers would go out on what was called the circuit. They would go to one county seat and for a week, and then they would conduct legal business, and then they go to the next county seat, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And Lincoln was one of the only lawyers who was on the entire circuit. Most lawyers just went on part of the circuit, and he was the only one who didn't go home on weekends. And everybody assumed, all his lawyer friends assumed, the reason he didn't go home on weekends and stayed in these dreary little villages over a Sabbath was because his home life was so unhappy. And so her terrible temper made life very difficult for Lincoln. And it was manifest not just in her mistreatment of Lincoln, but she physically abused servants in the home. She had a very difficult time keeping servants because she treated them with violence at times. She would strike them with brooms and slap them. So she had a very hard time keeping servants.
But she also apparently had outbursts with different people and different social settings, right?
That's true. That's true. And she could embarrass but for example, she could tongue lash Lincoln, not just in the privacy of her own home, but in front of other people. Lincoln, for example, gives a speech during the Civil War to a charity event, and he had been promised by the organizers that he wouldn't have to speak. He would just be on the stage and by his presence endorse the charity. Well, then the audience demanded that he give a speech. And so he got up and said, well, I'm not prepared to give a speech. And I was told that I wouldn't have to speak. And I'm very reluctant to speak off the cuff because everything I say is going to be scrutinized very closely. But I will say that I'm very grateful to this organization for the charitable work it does. And let's give them a round of applause. Well, Lincoln then is awaiting the carriage to take him back to the White House. And with him is his wife and a general from Illinois. And the general from Illinois then recalls what was said in his presence. Mrs. Lincoln turns to her husband and says, and this is in front of this other guy, "That's the worst speech I ever heard anybody give. I was so embarrassed. I wanted the earth to open and swallow me up. I don't see how any man can get up before an audience and say such banal things." She's insulting Lincoln right in front of this other guy. We have testimony from an Oregon senator that when he used to go riding with the Lincolns, Mrs. Lincoln would turn on him and say the same sorts of things, and right in front of a senator from Oregon.
She had a altercation with Ulysses Grant, right?
Absolutely. And she mistreats Mrs. Grant badly. And one of the reasons why John Wilkes Booth was able to murder Abraham Lincoln is because the Grants were not with them, with the Lincolns in Ford's Theater on that night of April 14th, 1865. And the reason the Grants weren't there is because Mrs. Lincoln, the previous month, had gone down with her husband to visit the front where at Grant's headquarters. They stayed there for several days. And in the course of that time, Mrs. Lincoln treated Mrs. Grant with a very haughty, imperious attitude, and snubbed her and said, "How dare you sit down in my presence without my permission?" Things like that. And so Mrs. Grant said to her husband, "Honey, I don't want to go to the Ford's Theater performance night with that woman. So let's make up some kind of excuse so that we can get out of this social situation. And so we'll go visit our children in New Jersey."
Give us two quick thumbnails of the way Mary Todd maybe misused her position as First Lady.
That's one of the things that I discovered to my astonishment is how much corruption she was engaged in. Now, and this is attested to in a diary that was kept by one of Lincoln's good friends, a gentleman named Orville Browning. And Browning and Lincoln had served in the Illinois state legislature. They were lawyers together in the bar. They were political activists for the Whig Party and then the Republican Party. So Browning knew Lincoln quite well, and he was a senator during the Civil War. And he would spend a lot of time in the White House. And in his diary, he shares a lot of information about those interactions. But when the diary was published back in the 1930s in 2 fat volumes, there were 6 passages that were deleted. And you go in and you see in italics, passage deleted because of reference to Mrs. Lincoln. Well, I managed to find those 6 passages, and they were all about how she was engaged in corrupt behavior, how she padded payrolls, how she padded expense accounts, how she accepted bribes and kickbacks, how she sold cotton trading permits and other trading permits, how she accepted or extorted money from people who wanted to meet with the president, how she extorted money from donors and the like. And so her extravagant use of unethical tactics to enrich herself were a constant source of embarrassment. And this started to get out. The news of this sort of behavior began to leak out and into the press. And when Lincoln was running for re-election in 1864, people said, the Democrats said, well, how can you vote for Lincoln, whose wife was unethical, and he had to know about it, and he didn't do anything about it? So her unethical behavior became a campaign issue in Lincoln's re-election bid in 1864.
Yet Mary Todd did have a few friends and supporters, right?
Right. Yes. And she did. And one of them in the White House was remarkably was a Black woman, a woman named Elizabeth Keckley. And Elizabeth Keckley was Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker. She had been known in Washington, D.C. as a particularly gifted dressmaker. And when Mrs. Lincoln came to town, she hired her to make her inaugural ball dresses and the like. And they became pretty good friends. And Mrs. Keckley then writes a memoir that appeared shortly after the assassination, a couple of years afterwards. And so Mrs. Keckley was a confidant of Mrs. Lincoln, and so there was one friend, and there was another friend who was the wife of an admiral, Admiral Lee, of all things. And Elizabeth Blair Lee was a good friend, but she didn't have many friends because she did have a kind of off-putting, imperious manner, which alienated a lot of people for her haughtiness and her condescension and her demand that people pay her deference.
So, Professor Burlingame, if Mary Todd had been First Lady today, would she have politically survived?
Well, it would have been pretty embarrassing. I think she would have been as was the case with Mrs. Lincoln during the White House years, an object of some public scorn and ridicule.
All right. So, I mean, in today's world of digital media, in seconds with videos and photos and such transparency, the controversy and outrage about Mrs. Lincoln today would have been instantly communicated. Right. But in the 1850s, Mrs. Lincoln may have had a reputation in the Capital District in the DC region, but did anybody really pay attention, say, in Maine or Massachusetts or Florida, for example? Was there any impact?
Well, the newspapers of those days were subscribers to the Associated Press and to other wire services. So a Washington story would be spread through the telegraph to large numbers of newspapers. And so readers in states throughout the nation were able to read about some of her antics, and that helped antagonize readers who came to regard her with less than admiration.
Again, referring to Vermont, there was a point in time Mary Todd visited Manchester, Vermont, and the famous landmark Equinox Hotel to prepare for a visit by the president prior to him being assassinated.
Yes, but Lincoln did not visit. Lincoln never took a vacation except to visit the troops at the front during his administration. Lincoln was a very conscientious man who took the responsibilities of the presidency very seriously, and didn't take vacations except, as I say, to visit the front, to visit the commanders of the Army of the Potomac, and so. So he didn't go to Vermont. Now, Mrs. Lincoln did. And that's one of the striking features about Mrs. Lincoln's tenure as First Lady. She spent a great deal of time away from Washington.
And actually, with the Equinox, there's a room there. To this day, it's believed that there's the ghost of Mary Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, which has been seen. So.
Well, I'm not an expert on such matters, but she did definitely stay there, and she did like it. And Robert Todd did come there, and of course, Robert Todd had a house in Manchester, Hildene, which is really quite beautiful and well worth seeing if you're a Lincoln aficionado and want to visit important Lincoln sites in addition to Washington and Springfield. Be sure to go to Manchester, Vermont.
Now, it's known how Robert Todd Lincoln and Mary Todd had a very difficult relationship, and it was Robert Todd, her son, who actually had her committed, right?
That's correct. And that was 10 years after the assassination. Mrs. Lincoln had been pretty neurotic from the time of the marriage. When the Lincolns were first married, they didn't have a house. They stayed at something called the Globe Tavern, which was a kind of hotel. And there was a rule said that no guest could sit down at breakfast until all the other guests were present. And Mrs. Lincoln would always be late, and the other guests would be somewhat impatient. And one day, Lincoln gently chided her as she showed up, as usual, late. And she flew into a rage. She grabbed a cup of coffee and flung it into his face and went screaming out of the room. So right off the bat, you could tell that there's something wrong with this woman. And one of the reasons why Lincoln tolerated his wife's unethical behavior, when she would come, you've got to appoint this guy who gave me a diamond ring to be a collector of the Port of New York, where he can make lots of money. And Lincoln would always give in whenever, well, not always, but almost always, whenever she said, you've got to appoint this guy or that guy or the other guy, even though they were corrupt. And they had offered her bribes, in effect. And the reason he put up with that was he was terrified that she would have a nervous breakdown. And after the death of Willie, that is their second son, their beloved second son, just a year after they got to Washington, she was so distraught, so depressed, that Lincoln took her to a window at the White House and pointed to a building on the horizon and said, "Mother, you've got to get over it, or else we'll have to put you there." And it was an insane asylum. So we know he was terribly worried about her mental fragility. And so he put up with this unethical behavior. So it was neurotic. She was pretty neurotic all along, but she became psychotic 10 years after the assassination, on the anniversary of the assassination. For large numbers of people, anniversary reactions are very strong. And so the death of a spouse, for example, or death of a parent, when that anniversary comes around, it can be awfully disturbing. But in her case, it was so disturbing, she really went bonkers. She thought that Indians were taking the top of her head off and pulling wires through her eyes. She thought that people were going to steal from her. So she took all of her assets and put them on her person and wandered around the streets of Chicago, and a notoriously gullible woman. She thought that the hotel was on fire. She thought somebody was going to kill Robert. She had all kinds of delusions. Now, Robert was worried about her, obviously, because, and by the way, he's the only surviving son at that time. The Lincolns had 4 boys, and Robert was the only one to reach adulthood. And so by the time of the Chicago fire, all the other boys were dead. So Robert takes over and becomes in effect, the person in charge of taking care of his mother. And he was terrified that she would go and have all of her assets, which were considerable. She inherited what we would, in modern dollars, would be at least $3 million. And she was so gullible, he was terribly worried that, and he didn't need the money. He was a successful lawyer, but he was worried about her. Now, today, in a situation like that, we could have a conservator appointed to keep somebody from being reckless with their assets. But in those days, you couldn't appoint a conservator unless the person was committed, had to be adjudged insane. And it had to be in Illinois, it had to be before a jury trial. So she had a jury trial, which was something of a farce by modern standards, but nevertheless, by the standards of the time, was pretty advanced. And she was committed to what was a very genteel mental hospital in Batavia, Illinois. And she was there for 4 months. And she was then released and because she had gotten her act together. But Robert Todd is oftentimes criticized for having done this cruel thing, but he shouldn't be criticized. He did what a dutiful son under those circumstances had to do. And I'm no great fan of Robert Lincoln in general. I think he lacked a lot of his father's endearing qualities, but it seemed to me as the protector of his mother's interests, he behaved in a responsible and admirable fashion.
Professor Burlingame, unfortunately, our time is just about out, and we really should do part 2 sometime. An American Marriage by Professor Michael Burlingame, and it's gotten a lot of attention and interest, and I want to thank you for being our guest with me on GNAT-TV. This is Danny Frank for GNAT-TV.
Thank you so much, Danny. Thank you so much.